Good morning, Stockholm. Good morning, everyone. Excellent to have you here. Thank you very, very much for joining this event that is going to discuss a roadmap to a nature-positive economy. My name is Marco Lambertini. I'm the Director General of WWF International, and I'm going to be joined very soon on stage by some incredible speakers and players in the sustainability agenda. 50 years ago, as we all know by now, there was the first UN Conference on the Environment. And today, 50 years on, we know exactly what has happened. In fact, has happened exactly what the conference said and warned us could happen. We have been developing very fast. Some people are saying that today is the best time for humans ever. And it's true. In many ways, human development has progressed in so many positive, different ways. But what we didn't fully appreciate and realize is that that development, that progress, was actually based on not exactly sustainable model, particularly from an environmental perspective. And so we didn't value nature properly, we didn't take into account the externalities of our economic development model, and we found ourselves today facing a double, triple, quadruple crisis in terms of climate change, nature loss, pollution, and of course, even outside the environmental area, inequity and inequality. 50 years ago, something has happened. It was not just the UN Conference on the Environment. A very visionary, I would say, book was launched. Many of you are familiar with it. The title was very provocative, The Limits to Growth. And that book was exactly painting the picture of a society that was beginning to impact the environment, warning that industrialization, intensification of food production, pollution, population growth, and inequality in distribution of resources was going to lead to an imminent ecological, but also humanitarian, potentially socio-political crisis. And it was interesting because it was also pointing at two main problems at the time. Imagine, 50 years ago. One was that we didn't really fully understand the consequences and the implications of what we were doing. Super true today, still. Secondly, they were saying that one big problem at the time, was the inability of our society to tackle global challenges in a coordinated way. That was 50 years ago. And I have to say how true and actual those warnings still resonates with the society of today. But the difference today is that we know. Maybe we know what we didn't know at the time. And more importantly, many more people in society, in governments, in the corporate sector, know what's going on. The evidence of our impact in the natural world has never been clearer. The consequences of that impact has never been better understood. We know today that the externalities, the hidden cost of the way we manage land, ocean, rivers, it actually exceeds the contribution that the productive activities in those ecosystems, in those landscapes, are generating to the GDP. It's a completely nonsensical economic model in moving forward. We know that we are investing $1.8 trillion every year in supporting economic activities, agriculture, $500 billion, fisheries, 50 billion, forestry, 130 billion, that actually are not sustainable. So, well, 50 years later, that conference and that book, we know a great deal more of our impact. We frankly know very well what needs to be done. And now, after what the scientists are calling the great acceleration of unsustainable use of resources over the last, in fact, 60, 70 years, we're at the point where it's the time for everyone, government, businesses, frankly, consumers too, to embrace the great transition out of the acceleration of unsustainable development. We have all the elements to do that. And now is a question of embracing a clear direction. On climate we have it, we need an equally clear direction on nature, and a clear plan shared globally but implemented locally that delivers true sustainable development. So because we know that sustainable development is the only way forward for a safe future for all of us, for an equitable future for humanity as well. So today we're going to discuss exactly this, a roadmap to that future, a roadmap to a nature-positive economy, particularly focusing on the nature-positive dimension, which is less developed than a net-zero, carbon-neutral economy already, if you like, not moving fast enough, but already on track in many sectors of our economy. We're going to focus on that. We're going to ask questions about what that means, how do we develop, and how do we implement it. And in order to start the conversation, we are going to have two ministers. In fact, I will call them super ministers. They are with us today because they've done already magic, and they promise to do even more magic in moving forward. So it's my absolute great honor to invite on stage, first of all, the Minister of Environment of Nigeria, Ms. Sharon Ikezor, which I had the pleasure to sit at dinner with a couple of days ago and learn an awful lot of her plans and her vision. So please welcome Minister Ikezor on stage. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute honor for me to be invited here today to share a bit of Nigeria's view on the need for a nature-positive economy. And thank you, Marco, for your kind invitation and for all the wonderful, important work that WWF has been doing. Today, we're all aware that humanity faces two major threats to our very existence, which are climate change and, most importantly, biodiversity loss. These two are linked through our activities and economic system that promotes development at the expense of nature. At this critical time, we need to join forces to conserve nature. For us in Nigeria, we are living these threats on a daily basis, from the shrinking of the Lake Chad, loss of livelihood for our people in the northern Sahel region, down to the coastal erosion in the southern part of Nigeria. The IPBES report warns us of a 1 million species loss of plants and animals going into extinction. Linking this loss to human drivers such as changes in land and sea use and climate warming. The IPCC report forecasts that an average global temperature will be between 1.4 to 5.8 degrees above 1990 levels by 2100. And this will continue to rise even after emissions stabilize. These alarming figures are stark reminders that the world must unite and act promptly to reverse this trend, as we are eroding the very foundation of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life. We need to change our relationship with nature to one that acknowledges our economy's dependence on natural capital and accepts the bounds that nature have with economic sustainability. We need to create a nature-based economy that can mitigate the climate change and biodiversity risks and bring sustained, shared prosperity for all our peoples. Nigeria aims to do this by focusing our efforts on delivering on the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which our president made at the last COP26, to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 for sustainable development, reform our economic and financial sectors, and also achieve the well-being of people and safeguard the planet. We'll also secure ambitious and transformational goals and targets of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework while ensuring their effective and successful implementation. We do recognize the need to urgently address the systematic economic drivers that contribute to nature's degradation, such as our misaligned economic incentives and environmentally harmful policies. This requires reforming the global economy in addition to mobilizing resources for nature conservation. This is one of our positions in the ongoing post-2020 global biodiversity negotiation process. We all know that in a global economy, one country cannot transform the system alone, and a coordinated approach is necessary. So we believe that the right international economic governance will support Nigeria and other countries in an equitable transition to a nature-positive economy. We will continue to encourage other African governments to agree on transformational and ambitious efforts towards a nature-positive, net zero, and equitable world, while taking the lead by valuing nature in our budgeting efforts. We must biodiversity-proof our budgets, most especially in Africa. In conclusion, changing humanity's relationship with nature and moving society towards a sustainable nature-based economy is critical. This must happen quickly if we are to prevent the threats of climate change and biodiversity loss from reaching catastrophic levels. It is already reaching catastrophic levels in Africa with the issue of migration that we are seeing today. So Nigeria supports the call for a nature-positive economy, because for us, when nature prospers, our people will prosper. I thank you for your kind attention.
Minister Ikazor, thank you very much for the words. Thank you for stressing the importance of the nature-based and nature-positive economy. And I love that expression, biodiversity-proof project and investment. That's brilliant. I'm going to steal it with your permission in my next speech. Now, it's my pleasure to invite, as I said, another really superlative Minister of Environment. Somebody would say, allow me the little joke, that could represent the government, but also the youth at the same time. and I am delighted to invite the Minister of Environment of Finland, Mrs. Emma Kari. Please welcome.
Thank you so much, Marco. And good morning, everyone. I want to thank you, WWF, for inviting me here to this fantastic event, and also for a very inspiring meeting yesterday that we have, and of course, of all the work you're doing for our planet. And I also want to thank my dear colleague for her inspiring words. I hope you listened every word very carefully. I think the topic today that we're discussing, a developing of a roadmap for a nature-positive economy, is one of the cornerstones when making our promise to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Is one of the cornerstones for making it come true. Nature loss is happening right in front of our eyes. It's happening here in Sweden, it's happening in my home country, Finland, it's happening in the whole world. It has been known for decades now. After 65 million years, the world is again threatened by a massive mass extinction. Yet, overconsumption continues and further accelerates the loss of biodiversity. Too often, we continue to prioritize short benefits over the big picture and over the well-being of our planet and our people. That is why I'm especially proud that in Finland, this spring, we have taken many important steps to accelerate our action for climate and nature. Just last week, the Finnish Parliament passed a new Climate Act, including climate neutrality goal by the year 2035. And at this moment, the Parliament is also discussing government's proposal for a new Nature Protection Act. However, it has come more and more obvious that we need new tools fighting nature loss and turning it nature positive. My ministry has just started a preliminary assessment on a new Nature Act that would kind of resemble the Climate Act and would bring the goal of stopping biodiversity loss and becoming nature positive after that into our national legislation. In addition to legislation, we should also take a look at where the money goes. It is not enough that we use money to protect nature. We must also make sure that none of our other investments harm our nature and our climate. Earlier this week, I had the privilege to meet a champion of nature-positive economy, Sir Dasgupta. His report has brought the attention of the world on internalizing nature into decision-making. Nature needs also a price tag because our economy, our lives, and our well-being is completely dependent on it. The answer is quite simple. We should treat natural capital like our other assets. We have a common climate, but most natural resources are local. That is why I have also launched a research project in Finland on how to address the findings and objectives of Sir Dasgupta's report in Finland. One concrete everyday example on where we should recognize the value of nature is pollinators that are becoming more and more extinct. Food production and our whole life depend on the services they produce. We rarely think of the value of the work done by pollinators. Only in my home country, Finland, their value is measured in tens of millions of euros, and globally, the amount is astronomical. Yet, the value of pollinators is not discussed in our national parliaments or in a European Parliament when the budgets are approved. Honeybees and bumblebees need suitable habitats to survive. But without understanding their value, we cannot understand the opportunity cost. That is, what is the cost of not preserving and creating habitats, such as unmown margins along the roads or leaving decaying trees in our commercial forests? Pollinating insects are a good example of how important it is to mainstream the protection of nature. The need to mainstream the protection of nature also means that we need all sectors of society on board. This is a task of ministers or activists, researchers, and experts working with environmental questions, but we cannot do it alone. In climate action, we already have a coalition of finance ministers on climate action. The coalition has made valuable progress in developing a coherent approach in integrating climate change into economic, fiscal, and financial means. This way of working has been very promising, and now they are considering a similar approach for biodiversity. This is most welcome. Although many questions linked to nature are local, our economy is global. No country can truly transformative economical or financial change alone. We must move towards nature-positive economy together. Dear friends, the target is very clear, but we also need concrete stepping stones to get there. This is why I warmly support a concrete roadmap on this topic for making progress and the future work for it. And thank you for this very important initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Kari, and again for your incredible work. That's an example of how a government really takes the leadership in putting in place policies and regulation that will surely drive transformative change. Exciting, and I love your reference to pollinators. Of course, the bees are the rock stars of the pollinators. There are a lot of underdogs, flying insect, moth, and other things that are really super important. And this is exactly why we want a nature-positive agriculture, an agriculture that by 2030 leaves more pollinators to our children, not less, continuing on the trajectory of decline of today. Thank you very much for your remarks, Ministers, Ekezor and Kari. And now it's my pleasure to invite someone that actually is going to talk to us more specifically about what a roadmap to nature-positive economy may look like. And that's Karen Ellis, is our chief economist in WWF UK. So Karen, please come on stage, and let's give her a good round of applause. Microphone.
Oh, isn't it working?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as we've been hearing, there's been growing recognition now for the need for a nature-positive future and a nature-positive global goal, which we very much hope we're going to get at the CBD COP this year. But to achieve those things, we're going to need a nature-positive economy. And the reason for that is that we currently have a very nature-negative economy. We've been destroying nature at quite a fast rate for a long time, and it's not getting any better at the moment. So what we're going to need to do is transform the economic incentives facing all economic actors, from governments, businesses, financial institutions, and farmers, the whole gamut, so that they have the incentive to protect and invest in the nature on which their livelihoods and our whole well-being on this planet depends. It's great to see a growing number of commitments towards this goal of a nature-positive economy, particularly through the Leaders' Pledge for Nature and also the G7 Nature Compact that was agreed last year. But we're not sure that anyone really understands what it's going to take to get to that nature-positive economy, or really how to get there. So WWF and UNEP WCMC have been thinking about this, working with a wide range of experts and private sector, academic, business, NGOs, to identify some of the building blocks we think are going to be needed to create this nature-positive economy. And now we're building political support for a process, a roadmap, to take us towards this nature-positive economy, identifying the financial architecture we need, the building blocks, what is already happening, but also where the gaps are, so that we can develop a plan for achieving this. So this is quite a complex task, obviously, but the good news is we have a template that we can learn from, and that's what's been happening on net zero. Because in the last couple of years, there's been quite a lot of progress being made in the economic and financial system around delivering net zero, starting with a growing number of governments making commitments to net zero goals and targets, and then working with the financial sector and regulatory bodies to align financial sector activity with those goals. So I'm from the UK, and we were very excited last year when the UK government announced at COP26 that the UK would be the first net zero aligned financial centre, which I think was perhaps the first major financial centre, at least, that's made a commitment to actually align the whole private sector effectively with a net zero goal. And that's really generated a whole industry of activity from the private sector now. How on earth do we deliver on this? Because they have mandated transition plans to be published by all financial institutions and large companies by the end of next year, which is not far off. So that's all extremely exciting. The problem with that is that nature is not in it, in this transition plan process at the moment. It's not only the UK doing this, the EU and the USA have also recently talked about including transition plans going forward, and there's an international standard being developed for this now as well. So this is going to be globalized very soon, and that will trickle down then through global capital markets so that all companies across the world will need to think about how they are going to align or show their growing alignment to net zero in order to continue accessing capital markets. So the fact that we've got net zero in that position is great, but nature positive is not there. And that's a major problem because we know we can't achieve net zero without tackling nature loss. We also know that the risk of trying to achieve net zero transition without taking account impacts of nature may damage nature. It may have unintended negative impacts on nature. So we really need to get nature positive goals incorporated into these transition plans alongside net zero. But there is a problem when you try to suggest that, which is that there are major parts of the architecture which are missing. And that's what this diagram picture is designed to show. Basically, this shows the parallels between net zero and nature positive. So for net zero, we have a global goal through the Paris Accord, and we have a very clear metric, which is net zero carbon emissions, which we can point the whole private sector at delivering. We don't have either of those things for nature positive. We hope we're going to get the global goal at CBD, but then we'll still need several metrics that the private sector can actually operationalize. So things they can try to deliver. Maybe just 2, 3, 4 metrics to make it manageable that actually capture nature positive. We haven't got those as yet. Then what you need is global sectoral pathways. So, we've got an energy sector transition pathway that's been mapped out, so everyone knows what we need to do on the energy sector to get to net zero by 2050, and other sectors as well. We haven't got anything for nature positive, as far as I'm aware. So we need to know how the food sector, for example, agriculture, fisheries, forestry, other key sectors like mining and construction, which have major impacts on nature, how do they need to change in order to become nature positive? We need that mapped out at the global level and then translated into national level planning to facilitate the private sector, tell the private sector what it needs to do to align with this trajectory. And then what you need is sort of national level plans and strategies and economic policies to deliver that and incentivize that. And then you need the regulation, as I've already mentioned, to actually align the private sector with these plans. And we're getting that in net zero. We obviously don't yet have that on nature positive. So there's a set of things we know we need to build for nature positive if we're going to get it in the net zero transition planning process, for which there's a whole global regulatory framework now being set up. So we've got to speed up because otherwise we'll miss the boat on that new framework that's being developed. So that's why we have talked about the need for a nature positive economy roadmap to try and drive progress towards this more quickly. Very simply, the reason why we really need this is because it will not only stop the destruction of nature that we've been seeing globally over the last quite a few years, but it will also redirect finance and thus generate huge amounts of new private finance for investment in nature. And that's a key issue. Obviously, we know that aid and public finance are needed to invest in nature, and that's one of the biggest topics being discussed at the CBD at the moment. But actually, private financial flows will massively dwarf aid going forward to support nature. So that's why this is a really important part of the process that we need to get to grips with and make it happen much more quickly. So we've talked about finance, but I also want to touch on trade, because global trade flows are the other part that needs to be addressed at the global level. Because no country can really achieve nature positive given the global financial system and given the global trading system. At the moment, the trade agreements and trade policies tend to incentivize a race to the bottom because they encourage competitiveness based on cheapness of good, of how much it costs, not around good environmental standards. So it makes it very difficult for a country to improve environmental standards without sacrificing its exports. So that is a real disincentive to improve standards. So we need to tackle things in the trading system as well. Trade agreements and trade policies. We need to build more corporate accountability down supply chains so that consumers and producers of goods who are not currently paying for the natural capital embedded in those goods are actually required to do so. So that will also generate huge amounts of additional finance for nature if we can get that right. So this is really why we are looking for a roadmap for a nature-positive global economy. We need an inclusive and equitable process to discuss these building blocks and to build a vision for where we're going to get to, how we're going to get there, the parts of the architecture that are missing, and the priorities for addressing those, and a bit of a plan for how we're going to get there. Who needs to do what, by when, in order to achieve this? Because at the moment, we don't really have a plan for achieving nature positive. So this isn't really about implementing the roadmap, it's about mobilizing stakeholders, getting them on board with the process, building more of a global consensus about what's needed, with all the stakeholders who then have the responsibility of actually implementing that, different components of that by different stakeholders going forward. So we're already engaging with a number of governments around this and a wide variety of other players, as I've already mentioned, but we are still very much looking for other collaborators and supporters. So if you would like to be part of this process, then please do get in touch with us and come on the journey with us, because it's going to be essential if we're going to save the planet. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claire. Good morning, everyone. My name is Corley Pretorius. I'm Deputy Director of UNEP WCMC. The long name of the Centre, a Biodiversity Specialist Centre of UNEP, is United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre. But I don't expect you to remember that early in the morning. UNEP WCMC it is. I'm delighted to host a panel discussion this morning on the Nature Positive Roadmap, and exploring a little bit more sort of what does it mean, what's the rationale, where are we going. So if I can invite the panelists to the stage, please. Let me make way. First, Kumi Kitamori, please, Environment Director, Deputy Director of the OECD. Victor Gallas is already joining us, Deputy Director of the Stockholm Resilience Centre. Free seating, ladies and gentlemen. Paulina Murphy, Director of Engagement of World Benchmarking Alliance, and Clea Kass-Cook, Director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I need to move my seat a bit so that I can see you in this arrangement. Fantastic. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Victor, if I can start with you.
Yep.
Oops, let me just not sit on my microphone cable, as I was kindly requested. Yesterday, you launched a fantastic report, and it's all about economic and financial transformation, transitions. Tell us about that. What is the economic rationale? For those that didn't attend the launch yesterday, what are your highlights, please?
First of all, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for finally bringing nature to the center of discussions about the economy and the financial sector. I think that has been missing. One of the things that we discussed many things, but the rationale is that we know there are tangible domino effects between climate change, ecosystem change, and our economies, including the financial sector. And that those domino effects will become increasingly visible in the future in very, very material ways. And we know that from science and scientific insights from the last decade. We know these domino effects exist. Some of these are predictable, so we know to what extent they will unfold. Others are going to evolve as surprises and hit us in damaging ways. What is interesting to see now, and the big change in the last years, is the fact that central banks and financial regulators are realizing this increasingly. So for them, it's a little bit of a wake-up call. It's not only climate change, it's going to be ecosystem and nature change as well that will create financial risks for stability and price stability, etc. One of the things that we know, and I think we're going to discuss here, is the fact, of course, that finance is globalized. I mean, no government can move alone, no bank can move alone. You need global collaboration to get this properly done. And I think if we reflect 7 years after Paris and the commitments and the need for the financial sector to step up, is that they have not done enough and not act quickly enough. So we need a quicker push from governments to really make sure that the financial sector does not continue to finance us approaching critical tipping points in the Earth system and in ecosystems. A final point is that it's not, in this sort of globalized sector, it's not only about governments, it's also about what we call financial giants. So that's part of our report. And these are the big asset managers, US-based asset managers, so BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street. It's also those that provide indexes, index providers in financial markets at the moment, and also ESG rating agencies that are somehow helping to allocate capital, but to the wrong things. So I think for us, not just governments, not just individual banks, but also these financial giants, very influential financial players in the global economy.
And are we relying on goodwill, or is there also a matter of self-interest in those decisions, in them changing their decisions, changing their investment patterns? What's the types of risks that they're exposed to? You spoke about sort of systemic economic risks, but for the giants?
I mean, I think the risks are under-evaluated because we don't have the proper data, we don't have the proper models. But if you are an investor where you are invested in many, many different sectors, what you're doing is that you might be investing in activities that will undermine the performance in other parts of your portfolio without you realizing that. And that can happen very quickly. I mean, remember, surprise tipping points. It might hit you in ways that you're not prepared for.
Wonderful, thank you. And maybe we can come back to some of those points again. If I can turn to Clea, please. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development brings together fantastic guidance. You have a very active membership. But some of them are concerned about nature-positive approaches, and they need help. What's the kind of help that they require from governments or policymakers?
Great. No, thank you, and great question. I think what you highlighted, that business increasingly cares, is actually even apparent at this UN meeting. I was looking around earlier, now it's a bit dark, but I saw how many familiar faces there are, not necessarily from business, but people we're working together with, and it's really everywhere over the past 2 days. So it's extremely visible that not just business, but multiple stakeholders are increasingly caring. So on the why, and the reason was made about just makes business sense from a financial risk management perspective. We're seeing it increasingly. It's really also smart risk management. But business are also understanding that protection and sustainable approaches just to minimize loss is just not enough to reverse the loss of nature. And that we need to go away from it's less bad to more of a nature positive approach. So there is the recognition on that one. And we heard earlier about the global goal for nature and the measurable objectives that were set. And that's also quite clear for business, right? So that makes sense. And the other point I wanted to make here is business is definitely not acting in isolation. I know business is called out a lot, but we need to make sure that business plays an important role to work with others to contribute to this nature positive goal. And I think what I wanted to highlight, what we have done and what we've worked with others around this. We've worked with Business for Nature, Capitals Coalition, SBTN, TNFD, WWF, WEF, to align on the common language for these high-level business actions, assess, commit to nature transformation, commit to nature, transform, disclose progress. And this is very much aligned to building blocks that we've built together with companies. So we have over 210 members. Many of them work with us really on a very regular, very engaged way to say, how do we get this done? And what we're doing right now is we're working on 4 roadmaps to nature positive. I should mention, because I also was listening to Karen's presentation earlier, we really want to make sure we always do everything in full alignment and collaboration based on available guidance from SBTN and TNFD. And these 4 roadmaps are around land use. One is for forestry and another one for agriculture. And also the built environment and energy space. Built environment is really a rising area. We're having a whole session on built environment, focused on nature yesterday. So it's just something that's getting a lot more attention. And our goal is, on these roadmaps that we're developing, is to help companies understand nature positive in their sectors, and then highlight and specify key actions to help them become contributors to nature positive. And final point is, we are quite careful to note and to use the language of business being a contributor to nature positive, not using language about becoming nature positive or something like that, because we see really about helping business how they can credibly contribute to nature positive. So it's really, that also links to larger accountability, language, and how can we prove what business is doing and provide specific examples on that. I have more examples to share on what we're thinking around from a global accountability perspective, but I think that's enough for now.
Thank you very much. And there's certainly a great emphasis on the high impact sectors. That's the way they refer to in Leadership Dialogue 1 in the Stockholm proceedings as high impact sectors, and in Leadership Dialogue 2 today, actually, the session starting today, because they have the greatest impact on nature, but they also have the greatest dependency on nature. So the self-interest in terms of ensuring that they look after nature for the sustainability of their own production processes, for business continuity, and these kind of things is really strongly established. And yet, it is not really happening at the pace that we require. So this is something that maybe we need to look at, how international institutions, government policies can help to accelerate that action. And maybe this is something Paulina is going to help us with as well, in terms of the work at the World Benchmarking Alliance and the kinds of mechanisms and support that you have developed. Also, the very important sort of tools and signals that can be released in the market.
Thank you. Actually, following you in terms of the interconnected agenda, we then come in to think about how do we measure the progress of the companies? And it's not just about the risk management, but it's also their impact on people and the planet, so moving to nature positive. And then through time, how do we ensure that all stakeholders involved in this interconnected agenda are holding each other accountable for their actions at the pace required. But I'm going to focus a little bit on the role that governments can play, and leading governments. So thank you for your remarks. They were wonderful. Because from our experience, so WBA produces benchmarks. They show what companies are doing on system transformation and their impact on people and the planet. So stakeholders, whether it's the governments, investors, civil society organizations, or employees of those companies, can reward leading practices. They can place their investments, they can buy from the companies that they hold dear, and then they can hold the lagging companies accountable based on the transparency. So we can see from these assessments the size of the challenge, where the gaps are, and therefore what priority actions should and could be taken by these companies. And as you said, they don't work in isolation, and they absolutely need that critical support from all of the stakeholders, but we know also that governments are instrumental in providing the right enabling framework. So I'll give you two examples from our experience. One is working with the G7 on a sustainable supply chain initiative, and 30 or so leading food and agriculture companies pledged to use our assessments to align their actions to the initiative by the G7. But without the coming together of the governments of the G7 and providing the market signal for these companies that it is a priority, I don't think we would have seen the coming together of the business in this way. So it really gives that mechanism to bring companies to the table and to make consistent progress on an agenda. And it's actually been taken forward by the OECD now, so it's been embedded in the system. So it doesn't stay as just a high-level initiative. And then I just wanted to touch on, that's a great market signal, but we also see the importance of regulation So from another area of work on human rights, we have 4 years of data of around 200 companies and we can see there's persistent low scores on human rights due diligence. There has been investor engagement and there has been some movement over the 4 years, but it is really a persistent issue, and therefore we can point quite clearly to evidence to say that the companies are not, particularly the lagging companies, are not going to make the urgent progress required unless there is specific regulation. So really happy to see that the EU and some national governments are taking forward human rights due diligence legislation now, and that will really help lift the entire sectors. So in both cases, we've seen the clear need for these signals, and whether it's a framework or policy, and if it's used effectively, like with the G7, it really does enable a performance mindset in the companies. The regulation it's a compliance mindset, so this roadmap really enables the companies to move to a performance mindset, and that's what we need, as opposed to just companies addressing it through a compliance mindset.
Mm-hmm. And I think that progression from voluntary action into compliance and regulatory framework is a very important part of a roadmap in terms of laying the steps out and giving removing some of the uncertainty, if you like, for business, that this is the trajectory of change that is coming, so that preparations can also be taken into account. I'm very pleased you mentioned human rights, because this is something, the social connections to nature, as Honourable Minister of Nigeria has also indicated, is really important to bring into consideration. And as many of you know, this is also part of the definition of nature in the better framework from the TNFD, is that people are included in nature, and the social consequences of nature loss is an equally important part. But Kumi, if I may turn to you in terms of the work of the OECD, and my original question is government reform. So I'm not going to say government reform. I think, what are the kinds of transitions in governments, in institutions, in the norms, the policies that can accelerate this kind of action, nature-positive action?
Yeah, and thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation. So let me try to add on what governments can do. Or there's already a lot of initiatives that's very positive, but much, much more needs to be done. And one of the key steps important key steps that governments can take and should be thinking about is to how to reform environmentally or nature negative subsidies and support. And I think that's a first step. And we are collecting data on this at the OECD. And just to compare this with the public budgets allocated towards the sustainable use of biodiversity is around $78-91 US billion per year. But then government spending or subsidies or support that's negative is about 10 factors more than that, which stands at around $800 billion US per year. So, you know, there's something wrong. No wonder we are living in the nature negative zone that was very clear in Karen's graph earlier. So that, I would say, is the very first step that governments have to do to continue efforts to reform these nature negative subsidies. Now, then the other side of the coin is to scale up those that are positive for biodiversity and nature. And as we know, there's too little of that being done, not enough. And the reason why we are seeing what we see today is because, as we speak, the value of nature and biodiversity is not properly reflected in all the market prices, and that, you know, so it's really great that the private sector, there's a lot of activities, but there's so much more that government should be doing here in order to create a policy framework and to send all the right signals to market players. And then, so at the OECD, one of the things we do is to track what kind of government policies and tools are being used as we speak today, because if we don't measure and track, we cannot try to make effort to reform them. So, so this tracking of economic instruments that we do, and then we cover basically those policy such as the biodiversity-related taxes, fees, and charges, and tradable permits or tradable quotas, for example, in fisheries area, and etc. And this is something that we are tracking. And then you mentioned the G7 context earlier. We also prepared at the request of the UK G7 presidency last year an OECD report on biodiversity, nature, and the economy. And this is basically targeted at the actions needed for finance, economy, and environment ministries in G7 government. And of course, the recommendations will be valid beyond this grouping of countries. So beyond reforming the nature negative support and subsidies and scaling up positive ones, other things that governments should be really looking at are how to go beyond GDP and reflect this kind of a value offered by nature and ecosystem services in how we measure progress to go beyond GDP. And this is something that OECD has been working on for quite a long time. And then another area, it was also mentioned in the context of the linkages between trade and global value chain and biodiversity. So these are the two key areas that we are recommending. And going back to how the coordinated action is needed, as we know, the benefits offered by ecosystems, it's local, it's national, but it's also very global. So we really need policy coordination across government from the public sector side to make this happen in multi-layered way. So, and there are many examples more, but I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you won't believe it, audience, as we speak, the time gets adjusted. So I have time for one question, because we have His Excellency Minister Korea next on the schedule. So if there's a question, a burning question from anyone, a clarification, otherwise we can, yes, thank you very much. I think you just need to speak up loudly. Yes.
Thank you, saves on my voice. Hi everyone, my name is James Raymond. I work in economic transformation in Vancouver, Canada. Thank you so much for the panel today. My question is, what would a nature positive economy look like at a city or community level? I've heard lots of discussion for the last few days, and it's always about country level stuff. But what happens when it's a city that wants to help deliver on this goal? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. Go for it, please, Clea.
I mean, in the spirit of brainstorming, and there is a lot of action happening on the city level also here, and you see initiatives, C40 and many others. What it obviously, and we need to think about value chains and ecosystems approach and unintended consequences and all that. But what it could look like is to get key stakeholders together on a local level, ensuring local businesses, SMEs, but also some large companies, communities, mayors are key. Everybody gets together and at least have a brainstorming discussion about what it could look like. We can't come up with a solution like that, but often it is to get rid of some of the overarching complexity and really focus on some very local, specific examples that could work, bringing in maybe a local academic expert, civil society representation. I think it would start with dialogue and some brainstorming around possible solutions, because often the solutions exist. It's just about getting people together and having a discussion.
And I agree, and I think at the city level it's a great space to engage smaller businesses in nature-based solutions, in flood protection, in adaptation. There's food provisioning, community gardens that can be beneficial for pollinators also. So it's just at a different scale. Maybe not the millions of hectares that we're promising, but there are so many opportunities, changes in mobility that can also contribute to better outcomes for people and nature. So really a lot of opportunities. Yes, please. Paulina.
Yep. Thank you. Maybe just to add, if these frameworks and roadmaps are inclusive of all stakeholders, that includes the city players. So there's no reason why they can't be adopted for implementation at the city level. Of course, with modification, because you're going, as you said, from massive areas to much different challenges, the urban population challenges. But I do think these roadmaps, if they are coordinated and each stakeholder group knows what they need to do to deliver, that can then be implemented at the urban, in cities and urban level.
Thank you. Yes. And
just to add to that, I think we're already seeing some interesting progress there on building climate resilient cities through nature-based solutions. And if we want to add the financial aspects to it, the incentives are very clear for the insurance sector to do that and to help with that and do that together with cities. That would be my short answer.
And of course, the vast majority of people live in cities that are coastal.
Yes.
So you can imagine the opportunities also in engaging with the coastal land-sea connections. So no limits to opportunities. I'm really interested in understanding what are the barriers. Why is this not happening? Is it really our financial institutions, our signals? What is stopping business to pick up on, or governments, to pick up on nature-positive strategies? Volunteers? First, go for it, Paulina.
We stand first. Companies know what they're doing on climate. We have scientific targets. We have clear guidance. We've been working on that agenda for years. That urgency has to be maintained. But on nature, we need to scale up. But there is no guidance. There is no metrics. There is no data of what they're doing. So it's the unknowns, and how do we break that? And that's a big barrier to actually then taking concrete actions. That's why initial guidance, the market signals of the common framework are so critical.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, because this is an area where we are a little bit behind other environmental topics. Of course, there's been a lot of progress on climate, and as Karen said, we need to catch up so as not to miss the boat. And just to say the importance of a binding target or agreement at the international level is so important. Another example is plastics. As we know, there was an agreement under the auspices of UNEP to try to develop a binding agreement on curbing plastic pollution. That's just another example. There's a political will needed for something that's at the public government policy level that's binding. I think that's what we need, and we have a lot to expect from CBD COP15. Let's see.
Yes, huge expectations. Go ahead.
Very briefly, I mean, on the point of data, I'm a scientist. I love data. But we can't wait for data in this stage. I think that's going to be a challenge. I think it's been a way, in some regards, for the finance sector to just postpone action. We don't have enough data, especially when we talk about nature and biodiversity. We know that there are huge data gaps in the global south, for example. So I think the challenge for this initiative will be, how can we act without having full access to perfect data? I think that will be the challenge. And just to avoid that, that as a strategy to just postpone action.
Yes, the data point is incredibly important, and it comes up over and over again. Maybe it is solvable, maybe not in the next 18 months, but it is solvable. I think it's really important to also support countries, waiting very patiently, to support countries so that business and governments can use the same data and they understand the changes in the same way. So that would be another important aspect to look at. I'm so sorry, I didn't see you standing up. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yes, hello. My name is Martina Bianchini. I represent a private sector association, the International Fragrance Association. And I would like to comment on your question, what's stopping business from not doing more. I would say our industry is very close to nature because we source natural and synthetic raw materials and we make scents. So roses, jasmine, patchouli, sandalwood, many raw materials that come from nature that we make something that smells good. And the missing link is that, first of all, we don't speak the same language in the business community. And therefore, now I'm here to learn and hear what you have to tell us. And I was intrigued by hearing that you're developing a roadmap for the private sector to implement, which is great because we do have complementary knowledge. But the missing link for me is there are knowledge gaps on the definitions. How do you define nature positive? What is net zero? These are all things, terms that we use, and they become very familiar in this environment. But in the business community, people don't know what they mean. And we have a sustainability framework for the fragrance value chain, starting with responsible sourcing, going all the way to consumer. And our people always ask for, how do you define it? So my plea would be, as you develop this roadmap, maybe think about a glossary of terms, think about definitions that really people in the private sector can better understand. Thank you.
That's a very fair point, also considering that your perspective on it is also from a regulatory compliance point of view, and that makes it really important to understand how you need to transform your business processes and your sourcing decisions, your procurement, to be able to deliver on that. I would also like to add that it is definitely a roadmap for business, but it's not only for business, because we do need governments, we do need an all-of-society approach to be able to deliver on this. This is not something that business will be able to achieve on their own, or governments for that matter, and civil society, data providers, science has an incredibly important role to play on that. So with that, I think that's the end of the panel. Unless any of you would like to have final observations, you're welcome to do so. Reflections.
Do you want to start?
Go ahead.
Final reflection I'd like to add is that we cannot look at nature in a vacuum.
Yes.
We really need to look, obviously, at also climate, but also the equity and the social component. It's something that's core to us at WBCSD, and I think it links to a lot of the comments that were made. Maybe also why some companies or other stakeholders hesitate or don't always know how to act on nature. There are multiple issues at stake. Also social issues and equity considerations, labor, skill. We need to think about, it's incredibly complex. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be tackling it, but just wanted to highlight, we cannot look nature at it's only in a vacuum and only speak about nature positive. It is also about net zero. It is about an equitable world. So.
Mm-hmm. And to build on that, we have the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We have an intergovernmental agenda that is interconnected. So if governments take this roadmap further, to align it and to align concept of accountability within that framework, I think it will be, that's the consistency, that's the definitions, that's the common language that I think everybody's looking for.
Yes, maybe I'll add on the social and environment and nature linkages theme running throughout it. So as I mentioned at Deutsche, we are doing a lot of valuation work related to biodiversity, but we are also beginning to look at this ESG investing that's ongoing, and then how E and S and G are not necessarily looked at together. They are being assessed and progress is being made in silo. So we are starting to look at how this E and S, including gender, might be related as the market players try to develop some standards. So this is definitely the next frontier.
Yep.
Maybe just briefly, what I would like to add is that it will be very challenging to create a detailed roadmap. The reason because the context around us is changing so quickly. I mean, we need to acknowledge we had a pandemic, we have a war with massive repercussions all over the world, so it's going to be a very, very bumpy ride in the future. So how do you create a roadmap that helps us navigate in turbulence? And I think that's going to be very, very challenging.
There are two thoughts that I would like to leave in response to your final remarks. I mean, in the leadership dialogue, one process, a preparatory process, is a recognition for these economic transitions. And there's also a recognition that it needs to be fair and just. And I think coming back to the point about inclusivity, about equality, about thinking at those dimensions, because it will mean that we are leaving or phasing out some industries and we transforming others. So the attention to reskilling, to green jobs, to education, science, technology sharing is a really important aspect of it. Second point is it needs to happen now. So yes, we don't necessarily need to do it from the start for the world, but maybe we can look at the initiatives, the very great initiatives of Nigeria, Finland, commitments in political will in other countries. We're going to hear from the minister in a moment, and build on those examples to really take the initiative forward. Thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you to the audience. And if I can do a proper introduction, Minister, after I've referred to you so many times, please, you are invited to, with your closing remarks for the session. Minister Correa is the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia. Muchas gracias, Minister.
Gracias. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, WWF, all our friends. Thank you for the support that you give us every day to our country. To my colleagues and friends from Finland, Nigeria, and friends from the private sector, young people that is here also in Stockholm, we are indebted to nature. Every year, as the WWF has let us know, we exhaust 4 or 5 months in advance the resources we should use for the full 12 months. Thus, if the planet was a bank, we would surely all be looking for solutions to pay off this debt. But since no one insistently calls us to collect this debt from us, the solutions we find just come and go, from one assembly to another, from one agreement to other treaty, without us reaching a definitive relief. In 1972, here in Stockholm, the whole world agreed that environmental action was a global issue. That's why I'm pleased that today, 50 years later, there are steps being taken to draw up a roadmap for a nature-positive economy. A roadmap that will enable the necessary actions to achieve that kind of economy. Because the triple crisis we are facing, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, is costing us. And Colombia, the second most biodiverse country in the world, wants to be part of the solution. To not only to leave a legacy for Colombians, but also for humanity as a whole. In Colombia, the government has committed to a productive transition in order to become a superpower in bioeconomy and move from a linear economy to a circular one. We estimate that by 2030, 2.5 million new jobs will be generated from the bioeconomy, and that by 2050, this sector will generate 20% of our national GDP. For this reason, we have decided to take the road to zero, a clear path towards carbon neutrality and positive biodiversity. This is a commitment to give a value to nature, which is our greatest heritage, Colombia's heritage. To produce by conserving and conserving by producing. This is how we have decided to have a regional leadership in all kinds of forums and summits. Whether it be in the negotiation process of the post-2020 framework to reverse the loss of biodiversity, or in the pre-COP 15 in October last year. We have also actively participated in the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, the Global Partnership for Oceans, and the Leaders Pledge for Nature. And in fact, Colombia is currently the champion country of the Leaders Pledge for Nature. So today we ask the world that the next coalition has to be the coalition of action. We need action now. And that this has to be complemented by enough resources to phase out debt with nature. Your Excellencies, from Colombia, we have decided not to wait any longer. We are climate leaders, and we want to be an example. We have to be an example. Today, we can proudly say that we have a robust regulatory framework and that we have laid the foundation for a financial path to achieve our climate protection and conservation objectives. Because we will be one of the countries in the world, the first countries in the world to declare our 30% of our marine and continental areas as protected areas 8 years before. 8 years before that pledge, the pledge of the High Ambition Coalition. So we are working so hard because we need action. Marco. In addition, now we have a green taxonomy to help mobilize financing for sustainable projects and avoid greenwashing. We also have tools such as the voluntary carbon market and the carbon tax, which strengthen the development of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation projects, in addition to improving the quality of life of communities. Likewise, in 2021, Colombia successfully issued 2 green sovereign bonds, which support the financing of water management projects, a sustainable transportation system, and the protection of biodiversity. At the same time, we are currently working on our own carbon emissions trading system, which will come into operation in 2023. But we also strongly believe in nature-based solutions. That's why we decided to plant 180 million trees, and we are restoring more than 300,000 hectares. That's why we decided to implement blue carbon mechanism in mangrove ecosystems with the first Verra-certified project of its kind. And that's why we are planting 1 million corals. We are restoring 200 hectares on the Caribbean and the Pacific coast to address the effects of climate change on our island and coast. And that's why we are working with majors in a new concept, in a new strategy, biodiverse cities. Cities that put in the middle of the development nature and people. And we have a frontal, determined fight against deforestation. Your Excellencies, we don't have a planet B. We call for action, and now, with truly transformative goals and with collective efforts such as the ones we proposed here in Stockholm, so that in the next 50 years, history will say that this meeting was worthwhile and that we were part of a new turning point. Marco, friends, we need to have goals, challenges, and we think that we need to have 2 big goals: to be carbon neutral and nature positive. Thank you very much.
Wow, Carlos, thank you so much for your very direct but remarks, but particularly I have to say for being a champion of both the climate and the nature agenda, not just in words, but in acts and legislation and financing. Congratulations. Thank you very much to you, your leadership and your present leadership and the country that I'm sure will continue to maintain the leadership at a global level. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Minister Richiazor. Thank you very much, Minister Kari, Minister Correa. Thank you to all the excellent panelists, Karen, for the wonderful, simple presentation of a very complicated topic. Thank you, Corley, for the facilitation of the panel. There were plenty of excellent inputs and plenty of great questions still to be answered. Let's face it, it's not like an easy job. We're talking about a massive transition, as I said earlier, the great transition of humanity towards sustainability that needs to happen and beginning to happen, as you heard for several of your remarks at the government level, but also we know at the corporate level as well. I hope everybody has made a compelling case for the need of a roadmap towards a nature-positive economy. Now is a question to develop it in a way that allows, first of all, to embrace a clear global goal. I love the conversation that was happening in the panel about the need for a clear, measurable global goal and metrics attached to it. Nature positive is not just a slogan, it's not just something that sounds nice and inspire people. Nature positive has to be a goal that drives action, measurable, injects accountability in the system. We need to be as accountable as on net zero on nature positive. And let me open, I can't resist to make this comment, let me open a little parenthesis on the data deficiency. Friends, I call you friends because I think we are friends. Let's not make the perfect enemy of the good. Let's not try to be too complicated. Let's not try to develop incredibly complex frameworks that try to measure everything in any detail. We know exactly how much deforestation is happening today. We know exactly how much fish we are actually overfishing in the ocean. Let's use those clear, simple meta-metrics and drive action to deliver a nature positive future that, of course, is also the foundation for a net zero and a safer and more equitable future for humanity. The last thing to say, one other thing that we know a lot about the science, we know a lot about the consequences. The other thing that we know for sure is that we can't meet again in 50 years. We don't have 50 years, so let's work together to accelerate action. And again, thank you to everyone engaged in this conversation, particularly back home in your companies and in your governments, for all the great work you're doing and you're going to do in the future. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you very much.